to talk about not only a policy issue, but also to present a work that took considerable effort on the part of many people. It's important to start with thanks to the Schusterman Foundation for their support for this project, to my colleagues at the Washington Institute who have helped me in so many ways, in particular Guy Rosen, who did much of the research and some of the drafting on the internal Iranian situation, Mehdi Halaji, who is our resident Iranian expert for looking over various aspects of the piece, and Mary Kalbach-Haran, who is our executive editor, who actually put the package together. I'd also like to thank people all around the policy community who have talked with me about this and shared their views with me. And last but not least, Tom, thank you very much for coming here today. When Rob talked to me back, I think, in late August or early September about this project, he made it clear that what he wanted to do was to take a look not only at the policy recommendations, many of which, frankly, you'll recognize from other ideas floating around town, but also some idea of what's behind the positions we take, not only the what, but the why. So this piece represents a considerable amount of background work and study and discussions with other folks, and frankly drawing on most of the volumes, or at least part of the volumes of material that are out publicly on this issue, to try to come up with an idea of why we should do X rather than Y, and what the problems are with Y. Frankly, there are problems with X too, because this is not an easy issue, but nonetheless, we do take a look back into the past and forward into the future on this. As some of you who are Iran experts know, I'm not an expert in Iran. I don't speak Farsi. In trying to figure out why I got the assignment, I concluded I am, is an expert in dealing with Iran. I've had 15 years serving in neighboring states, Kuwait, Iraq, and Turkey, where Iran was very high on the policy agenda, and 3 years in Washington, in the Near East Bureau of the Department of State, and in the White House, where much of my focus was on a daily basis Iran. So I bring that perspective to it. But again, I drew a lot on the writings and the advice of people around the government and policy community here in Washington. There are 2 takeaways I would like to leave along with the work. First of all, as the book says, or not the book, as the paper says, we're moving to decision in 2013. This is an absolutely crucial year in our long-standing struggle with Iran. Again, from the back cover, the stakes involved in the U.S. confrontation with Iran, given the volatility and importance of the region, Iran's innate strength, and the intertwining of numerous U.S. concerns, make this issue the most pressing and dangerous now on the U.S. and international agenda. So that's the challenge before us, the U.S. government, and the international community this year, is to deal with this very, very important pressing problem. But that's only the first of the 2 takeaways. The second takeaway, which will seem a little bit contradictory, but I don't think so as we get into this, is that no matter what the outcome of this year is, no matter how the nuclear issue is resolved, and I'll touch on that in a second, we're still going to be in a long-term struggle with Iran over its foreign policy goals and our own foreign policy goals. It will not go away as a problem for the United States. Again, regardless of how we resolve the nuclear issue or deal with it. Why is this? Again, we go through this in some detail in the paper, but you basically have a fundamental clash between U.S. foreign policy goals, basic goals that you can track back to the 1940s forward, and those of Iran, which you can track back, frankly, 2,500 years. We all know that Marathon is a long run. It also was a battle fought in eastern Greece between the Greeks and the Persians, right. So we're dealing here with a country, Iran, that has long-term, if you will, imperial or at least hegemonic goals in the region. And this comes through in almost everything that Iranian authors and policy people reveal when you scratch the surface. Hussein Mousavian, who was involved in the Iranian nuclear talks and basically is now a refuge from the Iranian government here in the United States, laid out recently in his book on the nuclear issue what a deal could be. And his description of how America would pull back and its military threat and its military presence essentially allow Iran the say over developments in a broad region extending well beyond the Iranian borders is an example of how the moderates think. And the people who are less moderate have even more grandiose views. And we have many sites of many of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard leaders, and other senior political figures. But we know these because we hear them every day, most recently yesterday from Khamenei on why he doesn't want to negotiate with us. So this conflict is programmed in the very nature of how the United States looks at the world and how Iran looks at least at the region. Nevertheless, how we deal with the present crisis, the first of the two takeaways, 2013, will have a very important, perhaps dramatic effect on how we can continue mobilizing the international community to deal with Iran over the longer term. In terms of this year before us, there are 4 possible outcomes, probably 5 or 6, but the 4 that are most likely are the following. First of all, a unilateral Iranian decision, one way or the other, to stop or slow down dramatically its movement towards a nuclear weapons capability. The experts know in terms of centrifuges and spinning and 20 and 90+% enrichment when you get to that point, but a pretty good analysis of it was done by Bibi Netanyahu at the UN General Assembly back in September. Sometime in the middle of this year, perhaps a little bit later, perhaps a little bit earlier, depending upon who you listen to, they might be at that level. But they could ratchet that back. They could convert the 20% enriched uranium to other purposes. We'll see. The second is, of course, a negotiated outcome, presumably through the P5+1, possibly following up on bilateral U.S. discussions, which just because the Iranians yesterday waved them off doesn't mean tomorrow they won't reconsider them. The third outcome is a military strike, as threatened by President Obama, threatened by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and as part of the policy repertoire of actions that we could take for some time. This would not end the Iranian nuclear program, but it could set it back for a number of years. Various estimates are covered in detail in the paper. Finally, the fourth option would be a shift to containment, expressly or implicitly by the Obama administration, where it decides that in the end we can deal somehow with a nuclear-armed or a nuclear-capable Iran. Again, which choice we wind up with will have a lot of importance in how we deal with Iran beyond 2013. The best choice, in my view, and we advocated at some length in the paper, is a negotiated outcome. But this requires, aside from willingness on the part of Iran, several actions on the United States side, supported by the alliance that we have painstakingly and I think very effectively put together with the P5+1 and with our other friends and allies from the Gulf to NATO and on and on. First of all, it requires us to put serious things on the table, which we haven't done yet. That would be suspension or ending of the sanctions, particularly the most effective ones, the oil sanctions, which have slashed Iranian exports between 40 and 50%, depending upon who you read. In return, step by step, for verifiable Iranian steps to eliminate the possibility of breakout with enriched uranium. Now, this deal is nothing new, nothing I've developed. It was contained in a 2009 offer made to the Iranians by the P5+1. It was suggested in our approach to the Iranians through the Turks and the Brazilians in 2010. In the end, we didn't like the way the Iranians responded to it, but it is out there, and there are various very important and very specific technical details on how this could be carried out. Again, some of them are in the paper, but some of them are out there in various other analyses. The second thing, besides putting sanctions seriously on the table, we would have to do is to ensure that the military option remains credible. Given everything we have seen with Iran, it is very hard to believe that Iran would actually go to the negotiating table and give up something that is precious to Iran, that it is taking a serious economic set of hits for to continue without recognition that the United States is serious about striking. So thus, any negotiation strategy needs to be complemented by the threat of military force. And the threat of military force, frankly, to work has to be credible. That is, we have to mean it. And to the extent that they may not be assurance or certainty of this, it's important for the administration to clarify things like, gee, what happens if we think they're about to break through, but suddenly we discover they have broken through and they actually do have the nuclear capability, or they have a crude device. Do we strike then? Administration is unclear about that. I understand the reluctance to come up with specific red lines. Specific red lines are something that any government is loath to accept, but we do need more clarity to ensure that this threat, which is a very serious threat made by the President, remains credible. By the same token, the negotiating track, just as it needs complementary military, a credible military alternative, the military alternative, to be credible, needs a valid and serious negotiating track. Here the analogy is with U.S. policy in 1990, 1991 with Saddam Hussein. Before we could convince the world, and frankly, convince the UN Security Council and convince the U.S. Senate to support military action, we had to show that we had done everything possible, gone the extra mile, specifically Secretary of State Baker to Geneva with Tariq Aziz, to try to get a compromise solution. Under those circumstances, believing that we would use military force was credible. Right now, my personal view is it's very hard to think that out of the blue one day, we'll wave an intelligence report before the cameras, won't show it because it'll be top secret, and say, we've got evidence, they're on the verge, they've just crossed our red line that we haven't announced publicly yet, and so the air is full of bombs. Post-2003, I simply am skeptical that we'll be able to do that. The only way that we can set the predicate for military action is to ensure that we have what is seen by the Iranians, and if not by the Iranians, what's seen by the international community and by the Americans, who will have to once again bear the burden of any conflict, and this could be a tough one, that we have done everything possible and that we've offered the Iranians a reasonable way out. So far, we haven't done that, and that undercuts the credibility of the military option. It would be a tragedy if we had to go to the military option, if we meant what we say, because in part we didn't make it clear that we were serious about it. So I dwelt a little bit on that because I think that's very important. As I said, even if we do resolve in the best way possible through negotiations the nuclear crisis for the moment, we're still going to have an Iran that will be striving for regional dominance or hegemony. We'll still have an Iran that one way or the other will be dreaming of a nuclear capability. How do we deal with it over the long term? Various ideas have been out there for years in looking at the problem and in crafting U.S. responses. Some have advocated at various times regime change, stimulated by us one way or the other. Certainly the military version of that, which we tried in Iraq and which I've had 3 years of experience trying to execute on the ground, I hardly think that that's an option we're going to look at for a long, long time. Other forms of regime change, I think, are even less likely to be on the policy agenda. We could have an uprising from the population. We've seen that other places in the Middle East. We could have a shift in the attitudes of the Iranian leadership, particularly after Supreme Leader Khamenei goes. Or we could simply have some kind of grand deal between us, the rest of the international community, and the Iranians, some sort of condominium. Any of these are possible, but none of them are likely. None of them are obvious on the horizon, and that means that none of them can be the basis for intelligent policy making. We have to assume the most likely, which is also the worst case, which is that we're going to be facing an Iran that is out to change the strategic dynamics of the Middle East for a good long time. So how do we deal with it? The approach that the paper takes is called confront and resist. I initially called it contain, but because there was some problems with containment in terms of containing the nuclear weapon, I was advised by my betters at the Institute that I should come up with another word, so I came up with another C word, which is confront. But confront is basically containment on steroids, and I'll get to that in a second. So it's confront and resist. By resist, I mean the various gambits that we're likely to see in the future from Iran as we've seen in the past. And let me take a step back and defend containment with the Soviet Union. That's often seen as a passive policy of sitting and waiting them out, as opposed to John Foster Dulles' more aggressive, more active rollback policy. But in fact, it was always a two-part policy. We did wait them out, but we also had a policy of rolling back at the tactical level any gambit that the communist world made outside of its specific orbit. We did that with Turkey and Greece. We did that in Berlin in 1948. We did that in Korea. We did that with Quemoy and Matsu. We did that with Cuba in 1962. We did that in the Sinai in 1974. We did that in Vietnam. We did that in Afghanistan. We did it with the Soviet SS-20 challenge. In all but Vietnam, we succeeded. In every case, to one or another degree, we used military force. Maybe C-46s and 47s loaded with food in Berlin, but it was military force backed up by nuclear bombers repositioned to the UK. And in every case, again, other than Vietnam, we succeeded. We have not demonstrated to the Iranians that we're willing to do this so far. That's my assessment looking at the last 30 years. In Iraq, when we did push back at times aggressively to Iranians when they came after us, we succeeded in quieting things. When we didn't act, they just upped the ante. And I think that that's a good lesson throughout the region. Once again, any of these possible positive outcomes could occur as we wait these people out and push back whenever they move out. You could see an uprising of the population, a mellowing of the regime. You could see a whole series of internal and external factors leading to regime change. But again, we can't count on it. This is going to be one of the defining issues and projects of American foreign policy for decades or more ahead. In line with that, a couple of specific operational points that we make in the paper that I would like to highlight today. First of all, maintaining this extraordinary alliance that we've put together that allows us to do the most effective sanctions I think we've ever seen is very important. It allows NATO to deploy an anti-missile system essentially targeted on Iran. Allows our allies in the Gulf, in Israel, and elsewhere to work quietly and sometimes openly with us. That's very important, and we shouldn't sacrifice that on the altar of one or another American unilateral initiative that we are sometimes prone to pick up on. Secondly, Syria is very important. There is no other opportunity for us from a geostrategic standpoint to nip in the bud Iran's ability to exercise influence over a broad area of the Middle East than to ensure that the Assad regime falls. There are many arguments for doing that, apart from Iran, and there are many arguments, as we all know, against it. But it is very, very important from the standpoint of relations with Iran. Don't assume that Assad will fall or will fall quickly without our intervening. And think of what we'll be facing if Assad is still around in a couple of years. If Iran, with a little help from the Russians and Chinese, wins. That's not a pretty position to put us in terms of a long-term containment or confrontation with Iran. Next, we need to be very careful in focusing on the Far East and the pivot, not to denude our military forces, particularly naval and air, in the region. Many of our policies with Iran can provoke, and in the past, think 1987, 1988, have provoked Iranian military action. If it comes to a fight, we have to win it. We have to win it so decisively that even the Iranian asymmetrical definition of a victory from their standpoint will not obtain. That's going to require forces in place and a willingness to use them and a priority to this. Nowhere else in the world will American forces be so likely to be exposed to a dangerous new conflict in the next 5 to 10 years than in the Gulf against Iran. Nowhere else is it important that we win this thing and win it quickly. In essence, from many standpoints, we defend our interests, we defend our friends and allies in the Far East by defending the source of their oil and the source of much of the security system in the Middle East. Next, it's very important that we discriminate between those things that we really can't tolerate in Iran's behavior, such as its terrorist activities, its quest for hegemony, its military threats and actions, and its nuclear program, and those many other things that we just don't like. We have a tendency, be it the executive branch, be it the U.S. Congress, sometimes even the UN, of throwing all of these things in one basket. This makes the Iranians think that if they yield on one thing of importance to them, we will simply come up with another demand and another reason to put them under pressure. It makes them think that we're all about regime change. If we don't make it clear to them that there is behavior we don't like, but whether we say it or not, we'll tolerate it, and there is behavior that we absolutely will not tolerate and, if necessary, fight to stop. If we can't do that, we're going to have a hard time coming to any kind of agreement with them. Finally, as Rob pointed out, there is a bit of, I won't say disorganization, but there is a bit of, as always in the U.S. government, go-it-aloneness with how we carry out policies that are very important for various departments and bureaus of the U.S. government. Iran sanctions is at the top of the list of Treasury Department foreign policy issues. The military angle is at the top of the list of the Defense Department. The negotiations and various other aspects are at the top of the State Departments, and the intelligence community also has many, many interests with Iran. Nonetheless, there's always a question of whether this is all adequately coordinated. At the sub-cabinet level, when I was in the National Security Council, my job was to coordinate it, and I have to say I didn't do a very good job. A problem like this does not lend itself to routine bureaucratic management when you're basically trying to find the lowest common denominator among many different agencies and interests. We need something like the program we put in place when we did the surge of having a senior sub-cabinet official devoted solely to the problem, or, as we did with the Al-Qaeda threat, the Syrian nuclear reactor, have a offline, very quiet, very secret, very concentrated, almost constantly in session, small group of sub-cabinet officials and dedicated staff who can work to take care of the problem. There are even other options. What I'm saying is we need to reorganize ourselves bureaucratically for this year of decision, or the decision might not go the way we want it to. I'll stop there and turn it over to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Tom?
Rob, thank you very much for the introduction, and Jim for the invitation to be here and join you. First, a few comments on the paper. I agree in general with the thrust of the paper. I have differences. I think they're small. They tend to go around different individual items, and I'll bring some of those up as I go ahead in the remarks that I have to make to you today. But I think your thrust is right, that we need to use all of the possibilities at our command, that we need to exhaust before the use of force the possibilities that we can bring to bear, particularly at the table, despite the fact that, in fact, negotiations don't seem to be prospering and are a very difficult course, particularly today, where the idea that Vice President Biden brought up at Munich, interestingly enough, seemingly supported at Munich by the foreign minister of Iran, has now been kind of dissed or semi-dissed by the supreme leader on his website within the last 24 hours. And nevertheless, that's kind of par for the course for Iran. Jim, I think, is in the paper entirely right in raising both the seriousness of the matter, its potential for great difficulties, and the importance of our attention to it as we move ahead for a whole host of reasons. Most of those have been discussed ad nauseum, and I don't think I need to repeat them, but it has to do greatly with our position in the region, greatly with our relationship to Israel, greatly with our dependence on that region, if not uniquely and of ourselves because of changes in our own environment with respect to energy, of our friends and allies on the energy relationship. And in the end, it has to do with stability and indeed the effort to move toward a more fixed set of arrangements in a region which has now perhaps exceeded its quota of turmoil by 100% on a regular basis. So we need, I think, to be very focused on that. My feeling is that as we look at this set, and as Jim looked at it, Jim in his paper have raised a number of issues which fall out of what I would call the most familiar construct, which is to do as he did initially, to look at containment, to look at use of force, to look at sanctions, to look at isolation, and then to look at negotiation. Those are all tools in the diplomatic toolbox that can be brought to bear. But Jim in his paper has begun to look at some of the difficulties. The problem that he raised on redlines, for example. Does an American president walk out and say, if this happens, inevitably I'm going to war? And you know what that problem is. And there is grave concern in this country about continued use of force in the messy Middle East. And indeed, what is the construct? Is this a problem, again, for massive mission creep? Jim referred to it. A small group that I belong to did a study of the costs and benefits of military force. It is the one report in the Washington region which made no recommendations that I have seen. But it raised very clearly some of the questions that we all have to face. And Jim included in his report a conclusion which I assume was parallel to our own, that use of force could probably set things back for 4 years. But if you wanted to do the full job, it probably required massive boots on the ground. And I don't see in the Congress, I don't see in the executive branch, and I don't see in the public yet the kind of commitment that would be required to sustain that. Indeed, I see the President and the Congress and indeed the public looking for ways to end the commitments that we've got in the region, not to expand them. And obviously that has to be taken into account, to say nothing of the costs that are involved. I'd like to also take a look at each of these options very briefly and tell you something of what my own opinion is with respect to them, which I think in the thrust at least is very parallel to Jim's, and maybe it's repetitive, but let me, if I can, just examine a few of them and perhaps be a little granular on the negotiating side, which Jim has highlighted and which I continue to highlight as a challenge as well as an opportunity, and that obviously the work of diplomacy is always to change challenges into opportunities, however hard that is, and that's what diplomats get paid such munificent sums to do. That kind of miracle is probably not yet on the horizon, but it may work, and I think Jim's construct is a very good one. Containment, a word about containment. Containment, in my view, has become a code word for lie back and enjoy it. It's inevitable. Iran is a nuclear power, and that we have to use deterrence to deal with it. And my own feeling is this has a disastrous consequence in several ways. One, it shreds our non-proliferation policy, which in my view is firmly based on the idea that the more people who have nuclear weapons, the more chance we have for accidental and miscalculated use, and the more, in fact, we tear up the red line of August 9th, I think it was, 1945, which was the last time anybody used a nuclear weapon in a military situation. The more we tear it up, the more likely it's going to be torn up in successive opportunities. And to me, this raises very serious problems for us, for the planet, and indeed for the problems of stability and survival that we not ought to face lightly. And indeed, if Iran goes, and if we in fact say it's inevitable, relax, do what you can, but it's not going to be dealt with, then I have a great feeling that Turkey will succeed in translating its angst into a similar approach in Saudi Arabia. Egypt, I don't see as capable now, but I think the will would be there to do it, and maybe others. And so I worry that the next round of proliferation isn't a one-off, but potentially an organized and serious effort to move it. And that is important as deterrence is, and I think deterrence is always important. And we should not forget it. It is not, in my view, the way to deal with this problem. It may be, if we fail, to deal with the consequences, but I do not believe we should, in fact, enter into premature capitulation of failure. I think that's very important. And the second point I'd like to look at is over on the other side, use of force. And I talked a little bit about it. I won't, in fact, spend a great deal more time except to say that the guarantee part in the use of force is such a vast use of force. Essentially, the military occupation on a semi-permanent basis of Iran in order to assure that it's not going to go there, that it doesn't, in my view, also seem to be either indicated or appetizing in any way at all as a way to deal with this issue, particularly in light of the fact that we, at least in my view, haven't exhausted the other possibilities. Sanctions are important. And the group that I worked with did a cost and benefits analysis of sanctions as well. Sanctions have been going on for 30 years. We have sanctions on a whole series of things with respect to Iran. It means that sanctions have put huge pressure on Iran. And maybe some of the palaver over the weekend to move in concert, I think, with the multilateral talks to bilateral talks was perhaps engendered by that. I can't tell you it was. Maybe it was engendered as well, as Jim points out and as we're all conscious of, by the military potential that's arrayed against Iran, should it go. I think that sanctions alone, in my view, in my humble view, will not do the trick. We have in Iran what I used to call, with respect to Iraq, back in 1990, the last chicken sandwich problem. And the last chicken sandwich problem was that in 1990, the last chicken sandwich in Iraq was Saddam Hussein's. And if you figured out where the decisions were made, and you figured out how you would get to the man, you had to, in fact, deal with the last chicken sandwich. I think that in many ways, the last chicken sandwich in Iran is the supreme leaders. And I think increasingly over the years, we have tried to calculate whether he's a free agent and he makes all of his decisions. And we've heard a lot from various people, including Iranians who worked with him. But my sense is that he does have a powerful voice. He does listen to other people. But in the end, he has to be persuaded. My feeling is that one of the currents that Jim pointed out, which I think is very relevant, working against us in this particular issue, despite the fact that it would be an attractive alternative, if in fact it could really work, is regime change. And it may be the Iranians like to play the violin on regime change as a way of creating some insurance policy for themselves that this won't happen, or maybe raising the ante in negotiations. I don't know. But I do have a sense that regime change is not our best core skill, that we have not had outstanding success in this department, that if you were looking for an expert in regime change who could lead the American government and be totally successful, you would look far and wide, I think, without notable success. And I think the notion that we would be prepared to base our future relationship with Iran on regime change has about the same credibility, I believe, that ought to be assigned to containment. Nice idea, perfectly splendid. But where is regime change going to come from in Iran if it comes? I think, as Jim pointed out of the Iranian people. So far, that's been defeated by Stalin-esque muscle. And so far, I suspect that's going to continue because I don't see another approach, and I feel for the Iranian people in that sense. I think that over the years, we have watched revolutions morph. This one has morphed, but it doesn't morph fast enough, and it hasn't morphed far enough. But morphology may be the answer to regime change rather than necessarily the use of military or political muscle. And I think that we need to calculate how and in what way that plays a role in the process of both making sanctions more effective, but even more importantly, dealing with the issue of negotiation. Isolation has been, in my view, a very successful part of American policy. Isolations may be two-thirds sanctions, but it is interesting. Even those reluctant virgins in the Security Council, Russia and China, have found it very difficult to stand out against all sanctions, as we might have expected them to do if they were in effect dedicated to thwarting our efforts in creating some new friendship with Iran. I suspect they're concerned. I suspect they're not concerned enough from my point of view, but the fact is that over the last 6 years, particularly since Fordo, we have had more support, but we are probably at the limits of our support in that particular area. I worry about sanctions as well, because sanctions are like putting a guy in a pressure cooker and then tying down the valve. And the valve here is negotiations. And I agree with Jim that as we up the ante on one side, we need to find in a parallel fashion a way to up the ante on the other. And that's the negotiating effort. My feeling is that we've been at it for a long time. Our initial posture was we don't do negotiations with Iran. Maybe the Europeans can handle it. But in the end, the Europeans basically were frustrated because while we didn't do negotiations, we also were essential, in effect, in putting forward any position at the negotiating table, which their opinion was, as mine is, as I think Jim's is, quite clearly has to be closer to the school of negotiation that is best epitomized by the old Texas expression, that negotiation was a horse for a rabbit. We need to be in the rabbit for rabbit or horse for horse school. We aren't quite there yet. And everybody wants to protect their negotiating position by keeping some negotiating room left in the formula. And any good negotiation always transgresses the initial opening line of the red line against which we will not pass when we first start a negotiation. I see Sam smiling down here. We've been through this before together. There's always blood on the win-win field, as much as you try to pour sand and water over it to keep it hidden. But it is important to move ahead. Let me just say a few words about negotiations. Negotiations should proceed on the premise that there is a basic solution. And a little bit like Middle East peace, I suppose the number of us in this room could probably pretty well state the parameters. The real difficulty is the people most concerned don't want it or don't believe it or don't trust it. That's a little bit, I think, where we are with the Iranian negotiations. And here, my feeling is that, I don't know whether Dennis is here today, but I have greatest respect for Dennis in every sense of the word. And Dennis has raised the question, should we do big for big? Maybe that's the way to break through. And maybe it is. There is some tendency in what the Iranians are asking for us that they're going very big. But there is little indication, back to the horse for the rabbit, that they're prepared to put the big on the table yet. On the downside of that, there is the problem that 30-plus years of mistrust and misunderstanding do not provide an immediate opening for the kind of trust that's required, in my humble view, for big for big. And in many ways, it is a perfect opportunity to avoid coming to grips with a decision point that we must face very soon if we're going to get into negotiations. Are they serious about doing anything? Because you know the term a giant schlep. Big per big opens the door to a giant schlep. If we're going to discuss and try to agree to all these things, how can we possibly get them all done in a reasonably short period of time to understand whether we have a serious partner on at the table or not, whether anything can get done? So I am a little more persuaded that we should try a small package and try to do it as soon as possible. Now, I have to tell you that negotiations have been a long, hard slog. If you look at 2012, 2012 turns out to be a banner year. 3 meetings at the top level, 3 meetings at experts level. A definition of even some principles to guide negotiations. A willingness to carry on and continue even an electoral year, although The second half of the year was fairly well dried up by U.S. elections, and I wonder whether, in fact, the Supreme Leader's views on bilaterals are also conditioned a little bit on the problem of coming elections in Iran, although I don't believe that they occupy the same place in Iranian governance that they do in ours. They're also not as irrelevant as we might like to think them, given the ongoing battle with Mr. Ahmadinejad, which may also be a part of the Supreme Leader's reluctance to go for bilateral negotiations, because in Cairo the day before, Mr. Ahmadinejad, in fact, claimed credit for that wonderful idea and said he would be happy to support it. So we don't know. But it's wound up somewhere in the difficulties of the process. What could a small package look like? A small package, in my view, would have to deal at the top end with 20% enrichment. We all know that they're getting close to an amount of 20% material that would allow them, with an upgrade potential, which we believe they're capable of fabricating, to go to weapons-grade material in a sufficient amount to create one weapon. Whether they would be satisfied with one weapon or not, I don't know or believe, and I think there's big questions there that the technology people should answer, and it remains an open question, but I would like to see anything at all that slows down, puts a stop, and gets rid of the 20% material. I think that's the first end. In the past, we've been following a wonderful policy. In the 1990s, we didn't have Iran have any nuclear program. Then when they had a nuclear program, we should have not wanted them to have any sensitive capacity, enrichment or reprocessing. We let that go by because we still didn't want them to have a program. And then we shifted and said, okay, no sensitive capacity when they'd already developed it. And so there was no taker on that one. What we could have done 4 years before is probably a different question. And they started making a lot of low-enriched uranium. And so we didn't address the problem. We were still on no enrichment. And then they went to 20%. And now I think we are getting increasingly comfortable with low-enriched uranium, 3.5%. And a small package would, I hope, put a cap on the level of their enrichment, and I hope it would put a cap on the amount of enrichment. One of the many anomalies about the Iranian program, and I have to say first that the U.S. intelligence community, and indeed reportedly, but I think correctly, the Israeli intelligence community, both believe no decision has been made in Iran to make a nuclear weapon. However, I believe, and I think the intelligence communities believe, as Jim said, that there is a strong effort going ahead to acquire all the technologies and to master them that would be necessary should they make a decision. And the Iranians frequently talk about Japan, and Japan's status in Japan, for its own purposes, has all the technologies, but I certainly believe and hope that it will never make a decision to make a nuclear weapon. But that's sort of where we are. And so it's important, in my view, to slow that down as a first step and to do what we have to do. I think we need to be prepared in a rabbit-for-rabbit solution to put some sanctions on the table. I think easiest, of course, is to say, if you keep this deal and go on and continue to negotiate a further deal, no more new sanctions. I think it is also quite possible, because our sanctions process is very difficult to reverse. They built the car without a reverse gear. But we have the Europeans who could perhaps take some sanctions off, some financial transactions, even some petroleum transactions. I don't know. But I think that those are worth looking at, and I'd be prepared to pay a fairly serious price. And happily, I don't negotiate for the U.S. government, so I can say it. But I think it's important to look at that. A final point, and then let me end, is that over the years, the Iranians have said, we would have more trust that we know where we're going if you could describe the end state, even of the nuclear question. And as Jim pointed out, there are many questions beyond the nuclear question. And how they relate to the nuclear questions and negotiations is another very interesting and very difficult problem that I don't intend to discuss today, but it's on the table. And so the end state, in my view, is a very simple point, that we need on our side as much reinforcement and commitment as we can get that they will not go to a nuclear weapon, and that needs to be concrete. It needs to be in terms of caps on enrichment. It needs to be in terms of the size of the stockpile. It needs to be, hopefully, that they will be persuaded or indeed required to convert the stockpile in gaseous form, which is readily upgradable, to fuel elements, which in metallic form present significantly more technical problems to rapid upgrade. Things of that sort. We need to use technology. Secondly, I think we need a very serious inspection system well beyond what's there now. Many have talked about the additional protocol to the IAEA. I think that's the base case, but I think there are other questions there that the IAEA should be tasked to put its expertise to work to say, how could you monitor and verify such a deal in the best possible way? On our side, the Iranians have said they expect two things. They will expect the lifting of sanctions, certainly of nuclear sanctions, that is, those sanctions that have been put on with a nuclear purpose. There are three kinds of nuclear sanctions, in my view. One, I would not lift until the very end, and I'd be chary about that, and that's cooperation in materials and technology and equipment directly related to their nuclear program. The second is those that have been put on to punish Iran as a way to bring them to the negotiating table or to stop the nuclear activities we dislike. And in my view, you could be selective, but could move on those for the kind of deal that we would be satisfied with. And the third is everybody else's sanctions, which we have no control over, but which we would have to obviously exercise some help. And that doesn't take away all the sanctions. There are many other sanctions on human rights issues, on Iranian support for terrorist activities, and so on. They, in my view, ought to await negotiations if you can get them to deal with those issues. But that's important, and that's moving ahead. The final point is the Iranians would like to be told that they will have the right to enrich within limits related to their civil program. And that will be interesting because, in effect, the only palpable reasons now that the Iranians have to enrich for civil purposes is, one, to guard against the Russian failure to continue to provide fuel for the Bushehr power reactor. The other is to continue to make isotopes to treat cancer patients in Iran. If that indeed is the program, we then know what the limits are, not just in quality of enrichment, but in quantity. And that has to be done. I suspect they will have other aspirations, but I believe in negotiations you can deal with them. So finally, let me quit here and say this is a good paper. It's indeed a great paper. Read it. It will take you through the difficulties, the quandaries, and the hoops, and it will advocate a policy that I strongly believe in, that we have to have both feet on the ground and one arm moving toward pressure and another arm moving toward the door we want them to walk through, which is a nuclear deal that we can live with. And we need to be able to syncopate those and move them ahead. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I have to admit, when you were speaking, Tom, I had some sympathy for that poor Iranian translating this for the supreme leader, because they're watching it live on, live stream here, and he's saying, "Supreme Leader, you are our last chicken sandwich. We are trading horses for rabbits. And what, Supreme Leader, is the great schlep?" So we have really sent them in a tizzy in Tehran. Good job. I'd like to open up a question and answer session by asking you both about non-nuclear issue first. I know that both of you spent considerable time in your presentations on the nuclear issue, but let me ask about a non-nuclear issue, not least because one of the key themes of Jim's paper is to remind Washington that the Iran challenge no matter what happens on the nuclear issue, the Iran challenge will be with us for a considerable period. It will be 4 years this summer after 4 years ago this summer, after a previous presidential election, that Iran gave us a foretaste of what we eventually saw in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. Let us assume for a minute that the Iranian people give us another moment of their rising protest and their disgust at their political leadership. With the lessons learned of the past 4 years, not just in Iran but elsewhere in the Middle East, how should the United States respond this time? And how will that response factor into this overall complex of issues that we are discussing? I know that many people tend to dismiss this, but I think it's at least as hypothetical, a hypothetical situation as it would have been if we were to discuss this in February of 2009. So let us look again. How should we approach an Iranian spring or an Iranian summer in the context of everything that we're discussing today? Gentlemen? From the podium.
That's the kind of question you hope doesn't start off a question and answer period, because it's a tough one. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize in making the presentation, and one of my Iranian experts stressed it to me just before I got up here, was we do have to discriminate between those things about Iran that we don't like but can live with, and those things that we're willing to engage militarily to stop. And I hold with that. But on the other hand, it's impossible for the United States, without grave damage, to not acknowledge an uprising of a people against a non-democratic regime. That was the case in Egypt, and we have a mess there today. But we did the right thing in embracing the movement towards a more democratic, a more open society. In the end, we might not get that, but we wouldn't have done that much one way or the other, short of sending in troops to save Mubarak, and it's the same thing in Iran. Our ability to influence events there is limited. But it's very important that if the Iranian people, or a considerable portion of the Iranian people, and that's a question that still has to be resolved with 2009, take to the streets and call for a more democratic, more open system, we should say that we're in favor of it. That may have a short-term impact on our efforts to try to get the Iranians to negotiate a result, but at the end of the day, we're just going to look foolish, and at the end of the day, when it's too late, and that happened in 2009, we wound up shifting, and we wound up being damned by everybody. Khamenei announced that he wouldn't respond to the letters from the president because the president was on the side of the protesters. Meanwhile, in America, the president was castigated by people who do support democracy and evolution by essentially not speaking out when he should have. So to avoid that, I'd say that, first of all, it's a good thing if the people take to the streets and try to find a better system. And secondly, it's something that we should say that, and I have to be careful with the word support, that we understand, sympathize, and hope, and leave it at that.
Let me say a couple of things. I don't think they're fundamentally different, but I think they're factors that have to be considered. One, the Iranians tried to take claim for the Arab transformation, not on the basis of what happened after June 2009, but on the basis of what happened in 1978. And in my view, there was nothing further from the truth, and it had little or no resonance, but it indeed is now part of Iranian folklore, at least in the regime. Secondly, what happened in June of 2009 did not succeed, and so it was not, in my view, a very good pattern for what is happening in the Arab world, even if people looked at it and took heart from the fact that at one point 1 million or more people in Tehran in one way or another were at least seemingly engaged in a process of not supporting what their government had in fact put off on them as an electoral process. I'm not sure what will happen in June of 2013. But Rob, your question is challenging, and it's a very important one. Let me be as frank as I can. We ought to be in a position to be able to say that when the people of a country want to change in a direction that we think is democratic, that ought to be in principle something we're in favor of. At the same time, there's an old Texas joke that Lyndon Johnson purportedly used to say, and it was that he met a young guy in West Texas who was running for Congress as a Democrat. And he went to him and he said, "Sonny," he said, "I'll do anything I can to help you." He said, "I'll come out for you or I'll come out against you." To some extent, we all felt that at least in the June 2009, there was a penalty about being too jihadi with the street. And I think that we got indirect messages from people like Mousavi and others to say, quiet would be a good project for you. And we ought to take that into account, however much we feel about it. But I think we can always express at least a policy approach in support of that kind of change. What we do about our verbal support is a very different kind of thing, and much more delicate and much more uncertain. If there is a penalty to be paid by the people in the street for having our support, that should help guide where we go. If there is no penalty to be paid, or that penalty is supportable in light of the gains to be achieved, then I think we could be more forward-looking. But let's be frank. We shifted ground in Egypt when it was still painful, but not so totally apparent that, in fact, Mubarak had any chance of staying on. And so, in effect, part of what we have to do has to be to know when that crossover point has been reached and to judge that it's inevitable. To some extent, we quickly decided that Bashar al-Assad and his folks were inevitably going to go. And I still think we're right, but it was nothing like what I suspect was the timescale that people had in mind when they decided that was the case. And my own view is that we need to be much more strongly supportive of change in Syria in two directions again. In supporting change in clearly physical ways, while at the same time supporting a negotiated process, however much people may be disheartened by that. And to me, the hard decision there is, do we continue to support the idea that a precondition for negotiations has to be Assad's departure? I'd love to have it, but I don't think there's a chance in hell that in diplomacy you can get as a precondition something that is the central object of negotiations. After all, why would you need negotiations? And so my view is that Assad is not ready to pay for negotiations with his departure, but even if he were, the allied generals around him I don't think are prepared to pay. So every one of these is a very complex matter. And when we decide to change, we clearly have an imperative of being on the winning side for our own national interest, however much that is. But we have an imperative of being on a winning side in terms of what we'd like to see happen. And my feeling is the answer to the Arab transformation is still a huge question mark. It became that way yesterday in Tunisia, which we thought was on the track. I know it is in Libya. The uncertainty in Egypt is greater, and Syria makes child's play of all of them.
Thank you. Let's open the floor to your questions and comments. If you'd be kind enough to direct your question to someone individually and to try to keep your questions fairly brief and wait for the microphone. And we'll start on the far left and then we'll come over here. 1, 2, 3, and Ambassador Lewis.
On the far left before.
Could you identify yourselves just for the camera?
Bill Zartman from SAIS. To Tom particularly, but both. Can you have policy change without regime change? And what kind of thought process would we want to create in the head of the supreme leader that would enable him to change his mind?
I think we're both going to have to answer that separately. I think you can have a policy change if it's limited, and you're very clear that it's limited to them getting a nuclear capability. They're not going to give up their hegemonic desires in the region. They're not going to give up their mischief making. That you're going to have to deal with on a case-by-case basis by whacking it when you see it. But I think that if the Supreme Leader is convinced that his interests and his country's interests lie in not moving forward at that point, and that Iran will be better off the day after if they don't, then I think that you can do that without regime change. The problem is it's very, very difficult to penetrate the layers of protective advisors and such around him. But if you can, and that's a question, I think the answer is yes, you can have policy change without regime change.
You know, Bill, I would say that I totally agree with Jim on that. 3 examples. The Supreme Leader drank the cup of poison, as he suggested it, to end the 8-year war with Iraq. My old friend Johnny Pico, who negotiated hostage releases and other things with Iran, said he believes there have been at least 11 or 12 successful serious negotiations with Iran over the past 2 or 3 decades that prove that you can get an agreement, and so far he says they kept them. I haven't asked him for the full taxonomy, but I don't doubt that he has got a strong case. In 2003, not as a result of a negotiation, but as a result of developments which are still somewhat uncertain, but certainly had to do with Iraq, it is very clear now that our intelligence community believes that certain activities that Iran was undertaking, which were well beyond the civil program, and that involved serious military applications, stopped. So it's interesting. Doesn't mean that this guy's a pushover by any means, and it doesn't mean that a country with a many thousand-year-old civilization where bargaining in the marketplace became a super art form is going to be easy to deal with. But I don't think, in fact, the writing on the wall is necessarily all so negative that we should be totally deterred from trying.
Yes, in the center here. Microphone, please.
Hugh Grindstaff. What do you think the new team of, if he gets approved, Curie and Hagel will present to the Iranians? How will they interpret the new security team?
Well, the answer to that's easy, exactly what the president wants. But my sense is that the president feels frustrated. I believe he felt he tried hard, that he made a serious effort, written a number of letters. They didn't bear fruit. I think that Hagel and Kerry, in my view, have an obligation to work with him to see, in fact, whether a negotiating position can be brought together and put on the table that, in fact, opens the way for negotiations. To some extent, what is being suggested as a negotiating position is not too far from what the Iranians say they want. If they turn it down, I think we have reason to be really concerned and to be even more energetic than we have been in terms of the other facets of our policy. But I'd like to know that sooner or later, and the more you put down horses for rabbits, the less likely you are to know the answer to that question, despite the fact that it's painful to get there.
David, on the right.
Thank you for really 2 great presentations. Jim, first to you. You talked about the confront and resist phase. drawing on the Cold War period. In the Cold War, we kind of knew what was the Soviet orbit of power. Let's say the Warsaw Pact, for want of another phrase. What would be the equivalent for Iran? Where would we, geographically or otherwise draw that line like we drew it so clearly in the Cold War? And to Tom, I guess, two quick ones, which is in dealing with the differences between horses and rabbits. Some would point to the 5 bombs worth of low enrichment of under 5%, and say in the course of things, and it's not so hard for them to go from 5% very quickly upwards. How would you allay concerns of countries that would say that 5% is really under control? And you just mentioned the Khamenei-Salahi dynamic of the last few days. Can you see a situation where Khamenei allows the negotiators certain room to say, well, see the most you can get from the Americans. I'm not going to commit that I'm behind the negotiators. See what you can get to. But how do you deal with the dynamic when you're not convinced that the negotiators on the other side are fully empowered? What dilemmas does that pose for the United States at the table? Thank you.
David, very quickly, you have hit on a dilemma, but I would turn it around and say, gee, how do you make Iran as easy a containment case as the Soviet Union was? And I would say to some degree the Soviet Union is complicated in a similar way as Iran is. Both countries, compared perhaps to Imperial Japan, advocate an alternative universe. The universe that we live in is a universe of the UN Charter. It's a universe very much shaped by, we go into this in some detail in the paper, the American vision of the world, which is a liberal internationalist vision of the world, shared by much of the West and, over time, much of the rest of the world, beginning with the Wilsonian principles. That's a world of equality among states, rule of law at the international level, free trade, resolution of disputes through peaceful means, and the nation state. People talk about the Westphalian approach. Well, there was some alternative to the Westphalian approach that it was designed to deal with, and that was the universalist claims of religious-based politics. In Marxism and communism, we had a secular variant of a religion that tried to overthrow the international order by saying it was working to a higher truth. And to some degree, you've got the same thing with the Iranians and, frankly, with other forms of political Islam in the Middle East. The al-Qaeda people, for example, have, in the end, views that are not too different. The Hezbollah people, again, you look at the way they look at the world, they will blow up the international order as we understand it because they're working for a higher set of goals. Therefore, what we have to do, the containment is, they are contained as a nation state. As a nation state, they're respected. Their territorial integrity, which is an important part of a nation state, is respected. We may not like their system, but we're willing to live with it. That was the deal in Westphalia. That's the deal today that we can offer to the Iranians. But they cannot simultaneously be a revolutionary movement and a nation state, and that was the same problem the Soviet Union had to contend with for 70 years. Thanks.
David, I think Jim's put that very well. I think the point we have to work on is in the construct that he laid out. What are our red lines, national red lines, with respect to hegemonic activities in the Middle East? At some point, just as we have to address regime change, they will have to address the question of their Middle East aspirations. And those aspirations will, in my view, have to fit the Western value systems, the UN Charter, non-intervention in internal affairs. They can expect the same from others. A role in economics that plays within the rules that have been set up, as they may be interpreted in the future. And that, in effect, as a revolutionary movement, they haven't done very well. They've done pretty well in South Lebanon. Unfortunately, we helped them a little bit in Iraq. But beyond that, the whole enterprise is not there. We need to avoid entanglement, in my view, very carefully in Shia-Sunni contention. We don't do well with regime change. We do less well with choices of religion. We need to be careful about that. On the other questions you raised, concerns about 5% in breakout. You've gone just to the question that I hoped that I was addressing, that not only should we move to 5% as a limit, because it fits the scope of their civil program and what they need. But we should sit down with them and say, how much do you need and why? In other words, as a hedge against the Russians, do they need 3 years' worth or 5 years' worth? And if so, shouldn't that be in a form that is not readily upgraded? And of course, it should be under IAEA surveillance, just as the enrichment facilities should be under IAEA surveillance. If they want to make fuel to sell on the market, I have no objection, as long as we track it all through and it leaves their premises. So there are ways, I think, to build into the process what I would call ratchets against rapid breakout. Jim's paper depends upon our ability to know when they might break out. And to me, the big telltale is enrichment levels above what they are now doing. And we need to be very careful about that. And that you find through the IAEA. And I'm convinced right now there is sufficient cooperation with the IAEA to have a good handle on that, but it could be better. And I think that, therefore, if the IAEA were to be pushed out, that, in my view, would be one of the alarm bells. If we saw steady enrichment above 20%, that would be alarm. There are excursions in enrichment technically that fit the pattern of being able to go to 20%. Sometimes you get a batch that goes a little high and sometimes a little low. But aside from that technical question, something like that would be. If they get out of the NPT, I would become very, very worried. I don't mind the idea, in trying to nail this one down, to take their fatwa and tell them put it into domestic law, but take it to the UN, go to the Security Council, so endorse it in a resolution. Build as much international pressure as you can against the excursion beyond where they are, and then cut down where they are to what they need. I'd like to find a way to get them to use material less than 20%. Maybe we would provide it. Or maybe they would help them convert what they've got into fuel rods. Anything at all that I think made it more stable. On the other question is, how can we believe a guy when essentially he does things that we distrust? Fundamental problem in negotiations with your enemy. Don't know the answer to that. I think there are two things that make a difference. One, are they prepared to agree to a deal? And then secondly, to go back to Ronald Reagan and his best Russian, doverai no proverai, trust but verify. That's the only answer I can give, David, to a really critical question, but it haunts all of our negotiations, particularly with folks that we have problems with.
Thank you. In front, Sam Lewis.
Thank you for really splendid presentations and arguments. I'd like to hear actually from both of you, though Tom's presentation raised the issue. Let's go back to the rabbits and rabbits proposal that you ended up with, rabbits for rabbits. About the rabbits we would offer. There is a school of thought that the degree of distrust, enormous as it seems to be in the supreme leader about anything we do and anything our president says, might be affected by some kind of open commitment, somehow or other guaranteed, that we accept, not only we're not carrying out regime change, that we accept the authenticity and the legitimacy of their government. That could be added to a rabbits for rabbits package to change the psychology. Do you think it would have any such effect?
I have to tell you, Sam, and I have contemplated very much that same thing. At the moment, the degree of distrust is so large that any profession that we make will immediately be taken as another way of tricking them. And so the only thing that I can think of is essentially that we are prepared to take actions in conjunction with them in our mutual interest and not to try to do them in. Even then, I think the argument will be for those who don't like the United States that this is all part of some buildup, and in the end they're going to pull the rug out from under you. And indeed it's very interesting because one of our colleagues here in town has written a very interesting paper on Iranian decision-making. And the first 4 or 5 pages of that paper are devoted to the Supreme Leader's style. And this comes from Iranian sources. And the Supreme Leader's style with respect to the United States appears, at least from this writing, to be, whenever he gets a proposal to do something in the U.S., including bilateral negotiations, I don't trust the Americans. I have good reason never to trust the Americans. They're never going to change. He said, they're going to screw you. But he said, I won't stand in the way. And what happens? So far, nothing has prospered.
Thanks, Ambassador. I struggled with that in trying to come up with the set of policy recommendations, because I really do think that if they don't believe that we just want them to change their behavior, not their essence, they're not going to change either. And the analogy from my times way back in my youth as a diplomat was with the Helsinki Final Accords and the CSCE, where, ironically, as it turns out, the Soviets saw that as our acknowledgement of the basic legitimacy of their system. It went far towards undermining it in the end, but that's because of the flaws in their system. But still, they felt that way, and that opened the door to a better way of dealing with each other. And so conceptually, I agree with you. My problem is deep skepticism on the material we're dealing with in the Middle East as opposed to the material we were dealing with in Europe writ large in 1975. But conceptually, if we could find a way to do that, if there was some way that we could penetrate these levels of distrust and different worldview, we could land something.
On that point, I have colleagues at the Institute whose view is that if the United States' position was unconditional surrender, it would not be accepted by the Iranian leadership because of their distrust at America. Yes, all the way in the back, behind you, Mark. Sorry. Yes, please. If you could be brief, we only have a few minutes, so we can get a couple more questions.
Sure. Is this on?
Yeah, go ahead. Speak right in.
All right. Hi, Christine Vargas, recent graduate, Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I had the pleasure of having Mehdi Kalaji as a professor while I was there, and he's who introduced me to Iran as an academic interest. My question is for both panelists. Speaking of regime change and internal affairs, what can Khamenei do today that would absolutely tear it with the IRGC, who is, basically who's propping up to the degree that he can do the things that he's doing right now? Especially looking at them as an economic force that's really being squeezed by these sanctions. What's the one thing he can really screw up, and that would be it? And on the other hand, what's the one thing that Khamenei can do to really reach out to his people and garner a support base that he's long since lost and say, hey, I'm making changes in the right direction, much akin to what the King of Jordan is now doing with his people? What's that one thing?
Okay, thank you. And Mark, if you just want to give the microphone right to your left.
Yeah, a quick question for Jim. You talked about an organizing principle for the long run of what we all sort of recognize as containment, but what's the organizing mechanism for that? We can stretch the Cold War metaphor analogy so far, but certainly this can't be done by a war czar at the White House, as you found out. How do you bring in the international community? How do you bring in the region? How do you bring this all together so this isn't, number one, seen as a unilateral action of the United States, and number two, has the legs for the years and years that this is going to take?
And Howard on my left, Howard Teicher.
Given the challenges the U.S. government has had in the last 30 years in framing our Iran policy, it sort of plays off that last question. Ambassador Pickering, would you comment on Ambassador Jeffrey's notion that we do need a sub-cabinet post that takes a fresh organizational approach to shaping and executing our policy towards Iran, especially given the challenges we face now?
Okay, gentlemen.
On Khamenei, and I really got to run it too, I think the way to get rid of the IRGC is take them entirely out of the economic sphere. I think the way to begin to help his people is to run what is truly seen as a fair election. Let the Guardian Council put everybody forward and make sure it's open, free, and fair, have the UN and other observers come in. I think on the whole of government piece and the sub-cabinet idea that Howard raised, my own feeling is that Jim is probably right, that we need some sustained leadership that can pull things together, and whether that's an ex-com, an individual anointed, somebody from the NSC, we need a way to bring all of the competing players together. And I think that that's a useful and important approach, but it has to be basically anointed by the president, fully supported by the NSC, and obviously bringing the major cabinet departments involved on board if it's going to involve a negotiation. If it's going to involve something much more discreet and something much more sensitive, then a much smaller group, perhaps lodged in the NSC with appropriate cabinet departments there, that would be able to do it. I think purely the notion that has been a congressional affliction on the State Department, that my favorite hobby horse has to have an assistant secretary in a bureau in the State Department, has now brought us to where I think that last time somebody counted, there were 80 people theoretically reporting directly to the secretary. That doesn't work very well. Secretary doesn't have that much time. But it is, in my view, important to try to take advantage of the fact that in the kind of working group, ex-com task force that we're talking about, the people who represent the departments can mobilize some of the capacity, indeed in some of the capabilities of the departments, so it isn't so ethereal that in fact people are making it up of whole cloth as they go along.
Thank you. Jim, final word?
Thank you. First of all, Tom brilliantly answered the question that I was totally stumbling around on what the Supreme Leader could do to deal with the IRGC and to deal with popular opinion. In terms of the organization, first of all, Mark, to your question, I think that in the world of reality of governments that are imperfect, this administration, building on the last administration, has done a brilliant job pulling together the international community, be it difficult players like the Russians and the Chinese on UN sanctions, be it Turkey on the missile, the NATO radar against ballistic missiles, be it this coalition of many states that, as you know, having dealt with them so much, out in the region normally don't get along with each other, from Israel to Turkey to the Gulf states, all together pulling. There we've been helped a hell of a lot by the Iranians themselves, who have scared the hell out of everybody and continue to, and just did again yesterday after, with great and deserved hoopla, Vice President Biden made this announcement, and whack, we're put down again. They're our best friends when it comes to holding the international community together. So I think that our organization of the international community is brilliant. I worry, though, that as things get more intense, and as we are more tempted to do things on our own, sometimes through Congress, sometimes for military necessity, sometimes because we get a bad idea, it's going to be more difficult to hold that international consensus together. And as you know, the biggest threat to that is not deliberate action, but one part of the bureaucracy going off and doing something that seemed like a neat idea at the time and pissing off the entire international community because it wasn't run through the people who know what the international community thinks. That gets to your position. As many of the potential beneficiaries and losers of any rejuggling of bureaucratic assignments are people that I know, and I don't want to make angry at me, I'm very careful on what the specific model is. But any analysis of how the U.S. government works shows that much below the sub-cabinet level, you don't get people who know where the president and their own bosses are well enough and have the experience to make decisions. But those people, their lives are characterized by total craziness. Having been there, and a lot of other people here have been there too, you have so many issues coming at you in a week, you really can't focus on anything, and it's very hard to suck up the information and the decisions and the ideas from below. It is an extremely difficult problem. It sounds mundane, believe me, it isn't. So the way around that is to have somebody at that level. Somebody can be one person, it can be a number of people, who have been assigned to deal with this thing and been given the power to deal with it, and can draw on the bureaucracy in a very quiet, non-bureaucratic way so that every paper doesn't have to become the lowest common denominator of the 80 people that Tom talked about. We all know this problem. I mean, I feel kind of embarrassed talking about it in public here because it seems like something with a, you know, a pen some president or some national security advisor could whisk away. Well, we haven't been able to do it since World War II, and we're still struggling with it.
On that note, let me thank you all for making what Tom called the big schlep to join us today. This has been an excellent event. I thank you all. Jim, congratulations. Tom, thank you for joining us. Thank you.